About the cultivation of a temporal versus eternal perspective. Suffering and adversity forces us to make a choice as to what our orientation will be. Will we look in terms of the short or the long haul? Wisdom invites us to perceive life from the broader perspective rather than from just the day-to-day perspective. It invites us to contextualize the day-to-day in light of the wisdom of anticipating and being proactive concerning the patterns and also the whole meaning of life in terms of how short our sojourn is and what can we do in this life to count. What will really endure? How are we investing our time in such a way that we treasure the precious present? And it's my conviction that the more we really embrace an eternal perspective, recognizing how brief our sojourn is, the more I think we will also come to see how precious this day is and how valuable this day is and how you'll never have this day again. The years move swiftly, and yet it seems to me that God is using this in order to draw us closer to Himself. I think I mentioned it last week, that phrase, age conspires with God to take away our temporal hope. And there's a lot of truth to that. The older we get, the more we recognize really how our years are few. And it's wise for us to embrace that eternal perspective. It's also wise for us to contextualize today in the light of our calling. Now, there's a well-known verse. It's there in 1 Chronicles chapter 12:32. It's a verse really that's in the middle of something that very few people would actually be interested in, namely all these little details about families and people and so forth. And all of a sudden, this little word pops up when he's talking about David's supporters and Ziklag and so forth. It's in 12:32. Of the sons of Issachar, so there's a count of these men, the supporters that were gathered at Hebron. And it mentions the sons of Levi and Zadok and so forth, and Ephraim. And then it mentions, after Manasseh, the sons of Issachar. And then it just throws in this little phrase. Men who understood the times with knowledge of what Israel should do. And then it mentions the number. That little phrase is very telling. Right in the middle of what would appear to be just this list of things, we have this expression. I think it's relevant for our time today. Understand the time with the knowledge of what Israel should do. To me, to understand your time is to understand your culture. And to know what you need to do is to know your calling. And I think all of us need to have an understanding of our particular place that God's implanted us in within a certain culture, and also embrace a biblical calling. So how can we leverage our culture and our opportunities for today in the light of our broader calling that God's given us all? We have something we are called to do. We're here on this earth for a purpose. It's not random that we are people who are not accidents, but really are people who are agents, and that God has loved us, given us unique abilities, a unique sphere of influence, calling us to be at this particular time in history, and He's invited us to do something. Now, I want to stress again that I'm a big believer of being and not just doing. But the being is to understand our life in Christ, and the doing is to express that in the world around us. And so we are called to be people then who have a perspective. Another verse that I find to be helpful along these very lines, it kind of expands this for me. It's found in Philippians chapter 2. If you have a Bible, you can turn to that. It's verses 15 and 16. And I'm going to give you 4 C's that are associated with Philippians 2, 15 to 16. Let me read them first of all. After he says in verse 14, do all things without grumbling or disputing, then the verse, so that you will prove yourselves to be blameless and innocent, children of God above reproach, in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you appear as lights in the world, holding fast the word of life, so that in the day of Christ I may have reason to glory, because I did not run in vain, nor toil in vain. Now the C's that I have in mind here are, first of all, our character. Prove yourselves to be blameless and innocent, children of God above reproach. So he begins with the issue of character. And character, as we well know, matters. In spite of what the culture will tell you, character is really that which gives us true moral authority and credibility and authenticity. And we need to be men of character, that there is a growing integrity between the inside and the outside. You remember I've told you this before, that you can use three words: ethics, and morality and integrity. And if you recall, what I meant by ethics is a defined standard of behavior. That's a defined standard of how we ought to live. Whereas morality is a lived standard of behavior. It's how you actually live. Integrity is the degree of overlap between the two. So that the more your defined standard conforms to your lived standard, the more integrity you have. And this is why I said it's ironically possible for someone like Don Vito Corleone to have more integrity than certain ministers. Why? Because he had a low ethics and his morality was consistent with it. Not to say, however, he didn't actually have a code. He had a very fierce code. He was very much against certain things and very much for certain things. But the guy lived in some respects, and this is a bizarre thought, more consistently than many, many people who are claiming to be followers of Jesus. Very strange, in light of his own particular perspective. Now, obviously, our desire is to have a high ethics and a high morality, but we never, by the way, attain full congruence in this life. It's impossible. We are always on the road. We're always learning. We're always growing, gaining an insight. But the desire would be that the trajectory is such that it would be a greater and greater degree of overlap. And that's a very real desire we want to have. So that what we claim to be and what we are in terms of who we are when no one is looking, that there would be an overlap. Never perfect, but at least a desired integrity in this area. So that's why he says, for our character, prove yourself to be blameless and innocent, children of God above reproach. And then the next C, after character, is your culture. In this case, he says, in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation. Now, that's the description that he gave of first century Roman Empire, a crooked and perverse generation. And it's been my contention that our own time, right where we are and when we are, it has more in common with the Roman Empire at that time than any civilization that intervened. And I find that that's not an inappropriate description of our own time as well. A crooked and perverse generation. If you think about a Rip Van Winkle story, you recall it was in the 18th century that it was a 20-year gap. And he was shocked after 20 years. Now, how much do you think things change in 20 years now relative to what changed in 20 years then? It's a complete world of difference. And you can well imagine that if a person fell into a coma and woke up 20 years later and were to look at the kinds of things that we see, what typical things that we see, whether television, film, newspapers, magazines, I don't care what it is, whatever the measure, I think anyone would be abruptly shocked. It would be an overwhelming experience. They wouldn't know where they are, practically, because it's changed that dramatically in the last 20 years. And in my experience and what I'm looking at in our own culture, actually the rate it continues to increase. It's accelerating. And so what will happen in the next 5 years will probably be more than what happened in the last 20 years, and so forth. Coupled with that, the fact that knowledge is increasing exponentially, and wisdom and character is diminishing rapidly. That's a very volatile combination. When you take the power of technology and knowledge and put it into the hands of people who are moral reprobates, people who are actually moral cretins, that's kind of a frightening thought, if you really analyze that. More and more power to people who have less and less character as an overall culture. This is how I would see it. We live in a volatile time. And so as I see it then, we have this description of a culture. We need to be aware of that, because the thing that concerns me a great deal, among many others,